Hey everybody, welcome back to this final week's exploration of Psalm 23. In this last video, we're going to be looking at the last couple of verses in this short psalm. As you may know, the psalm is only 6 verses long, so not a ton in there. We're looking at verses 5 and 6 and also offering maybe perhaps a bit of a concluding thought towards this as the group is wrapping up. Side note to that, I don't yet know what the next subject is going to be in terms of what video we might be focusing in on a week from now. I hope to know more on that after this weekend once the group has kind of talked about what's coming next. So stay tuned on that front. We'll try and communicate that when we can. But with that in mind, let's dive into this last time of checking out Psalm 23, verses 5 and 6. So, one thought over the course of the last couple of weeks as we've been looking at this. We've mentioned the logistical description of where the Lord and or the shepherd is. Starting off with being in front of the author or the reader, in leading me, or before me in verses 1 through 3, and then we switch over to the shepherd or the Lord being with me, definitely in verse 4, and I think that sensibility is present in verse 5 as well. And then finally, switching over to the Lord follows after or is behind or is pursuing me at the end there in verse 6. So that's kind of that transition. We've talked about that basically in all of the other videos that have gone along with that, but we definitely see that sense as we come to a close now, that transition into the Lord following along after. Picking up in verse 5, we continue with the sense of comfort in the midst of hardship that really began in verse 4. We have that dark valley in verse 4 when the Lord is with me. Now we have the comfort of the rod and the staff offering guidance and protection. That's also there in verse 4. But here in verse 5, it kind of switches over to a sense more hospitality in nature, which is an idea within the Jewish culture that is absolutely vital. Travelers are always given a place to rest and sustenance, food and drink to recover. They're welcomed into the home with the washing of feet and anointing of the head with oil. So all of these different things that we hear, that is an absolutely vital aspect of Jewish culture. And so this idea of the Lord providing hospitality, or the shepherd providing hospitality for the reader, is perhaps understandable. What's interesting, though, is this table of hospitality that we're talking about is not away from danger. It's actually in the midst of my enemies, or in the midst of those that surround us. My enemies surround me, and that's where the table is. And yet the shepherd provides that respite. And not only that, but an abundance in terms of the hospitality that's shown. My cup overflows. It's not just you pour me a drink, but my cup overflows. That respite, that hospitality is given in abundance. So, one side note to this, some of the different references that I took a look at thought that this verse may be referencing back to the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness of the Jewish culture or the Israelite culture way back in the day. That's plausible. There's no reason to think it couldn't be an allusion to that. After all, the Lord provided manna in the wilderness. There were times of danger. There were times when enemies surrounded them, although that, to me, is more of a sensibility that comes about when they reach the period of Joshua and entering into the promised land. So, I don't know. Maybe there's some possible there that reference could in fact be there. But that's open to interpretation. Moving into verse 6. We see another switch, and one that's worth mentioning as well. We switch away from the present tense that lies in most of the psalm, basically the first 5 verses of the psalm, into more of a future tense, expressing a hope or a knowledge of unfulfilled promise or future promise. That's definitely there. And we really see this with the presence here in our English translation of the word shall. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, if we look back at the original language, or the original languages, we'll see different varying presence of that, at least in my understanding of the two different languages. Now, I referenced last week the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the original Hebrew. And that sense is definitely present. This future tense is definitely easy to find there in that Greek translation. Not as easy to find within the Hebrew, but take that with a grain of salt because my knowledge of Hebrew is very, very limited, and I will own that. I know just enough about Hebrew to probably be dangerous, and so take that with a grain of salt. But the sensibility of this future promise that we definitely have in the English is present in the Greek translation and maybe in the Hebrew as well. But it is definitely in there. Now, one interesting little tidbit that I want to add to this as well while we're talking about Hebrew, I took a look at that again, and we have the sensibility of I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. The Hebrew actually gives a sense rather than dwell, it's returning. I shall return to the house of the Lord my whole life long. Now, it points to the idea, the sensibility that would have been common in, at least in Jesus' day, and we see that in some of his good shepherd I am statements that we find in John, when I am the good shepherd or I am the gate and I lead them out and bring them back in. That sense is definitely there. Probably would have also been present within David's day in that period of time. Again, remember that Psalm 23 is attributed to David, whether or not he actually wrote it or not. But the idea that there was this central pen in a community where all of the flocks would come and spend the night, and then the shepherd who's with that particular flock would lead them out in the morning, and then at the end of the day would bring them back again. And they go out and they come back in. It's the sense of returning. Well, where are we returning? We're returning to the house of the Lord. So it's more of a rather than saying that I'm going to just live in the house of the Lord, which maybe we want to say that's heaven, whatever we want to call it. It's more like going out and coming back into it, so that we go out from the presence of the Lord and we come back to the presence of the Lord. Slightly different idea of in terms of translation or sensibility, but worth mentioning, and I think that's kind of interesting. So that really kind of takes us through these verses. One final thing I want to highlight, kind of a overview as we conclude this look at Psalm 23, the Psalm of Comfort that we are very familiar with. I mentioned this, I think, the first week or the first video. We oftentimes see this one pop up in the context of funerals. And because it is so comforting, the sense of comfort is present within it, a theme that we've explored quite a bit over these last few weeks. But, one more thought on that too. I mentioned this last week. There's also a sense, a possible reference to the idea of resurrection. We might make that argument or that interpretation when we hear in verse 3, you restore my soul, or as we explored last time, a better translation of that is you return life to me. Maybe that's a sense of resurrection. So, okay. But it seems in the exploration of this psalm that it is really pointing at a trust and a following of the Lord, the presence of the Lord throughout the course of this life. Not so much the life to come or the resurrection or heaven or whatever we want to call about, but we have this idea that the shepherd, the Lord, is caring for the flocks, caring for the reader, caring for the sheep, whatever we want to say, throughout the course of their life, both the good and the bad. And that to me is a comfort here in the sense of the life that we are living, knowing that the Lord is with us and we are never fully alone. Thanks for going through this exploration of Psalm 23. I look forward to whatever's coming next.